presenter is Deepak Sarma, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Case Western Reserve University. He received his Ph.D. from the Divinity School at the University of Chicago in Comparative Philosophy of Religions. His training was in medieval Indian philosophy. His interest in bioethical issues stems largely from conversations at the dinner table with his wife, who is a doctor at the Cleveland Clinic. Several sources were used in the preparation for this talk, but Professor Sarma reports there are very few sources on end-of-life issues in Hinduism. Those that exist, those before you, offer good clinical advice, but are based on flawed foundations about the character and nature of Hinduism. Much of his presentation is, in this sense, a corrective with the intention of offering a more nuanced understanding of Hinduism, keeping in mind the goal of assisting Hindu patients and families when they are confronted with end-of-life issues.
So I'm here as a corrective in a sense. I'm here to offer you my own stereotypes, which I think are more accurate. Let me first say something about the Hindu population in Northeast Ohio, which has become very, very large, certainly in the last, say, 30 years or so. It's a tremendously diverse population, and I emphasize that more, so I'm going to try to emphasize it using these slides. But a very diverse population. You should remember that India, and I'll get to Hinduism in a minute, India really was born in 1947. And prior to 1947, you had lots of small states that existed in some area of South Asia that was called India by the British. And so you have North, South, East, West Indians from the entire region who differ tremendously in terms of languages, beliefs, practices, you name it. I'll suggest something about that in a minute. Which is why broad generalizations about Indians and Hinduism are so much fraught with difficulty. You can't easily generalize except to say you can't generalize. So you have North, South, East, West. And up until, in these days, Hindus tend to identify themselves in terms of the geographical location. So what you learn about somebody from North India will differ tremendously from somebody who's from South India. So the sorts of end-of-life practices that you might find somebody from East India might say that those are things that they want to pursue will be very. So consider this when you think about the Indian population, Hindu population in Northeast Ohio. Add to that you have several generations of Hindus, Indians in Northeast Ohio. You have first generation folk who just came over, say, usually in 1968. 1968, there was a change in immigration laws, and you had a huge number of Indians who were able to enter the United States, largely graduate educated Indians who came in 1968. And as you can imagine, these 1968 Indians, my parents were included in that group, had children like myself. I was born and raised in the United States. And so we're yet another generation of Hindu who looks towards Hinduism very differently than our parents. And now that we have reached an age of being able to become parents ourselves, I mentioned that I have two children. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old who's going to turn 1 this weekend. And so we've got a third generation of Hindus who are really the youngest Hindus in America and the most removed from the original source of Hinduism. So consequently, the kinds of Hindus they are is going to vary. Right? How they're taught about Hinduism, how orthodox they are, what beliefs they want to hold on to, what they were taught by their parents, and so on and so forth, is going to vary. And hopefully, you will consider this when you come across somebody who self-identifies as Hindu. Where are they from in India, and what generation are they? And all of that is going to change what sorts of practices they consider the best practices for end-of-life procedures, and more broadly, what sort of Hindu they are. So that's another kind of broad sense of diversity. The next sort of category of Hindus we find in Northeast Ohio are parents and relatives visiting from India. So you have scores of parents and relatives who visit. And the parents who visit will be, of course, parents of first-generation immigrants who come. Oftentimes, these parents come to take care of their children. Let's just say their grandchildren. And so the parents who come to India while their children are working in the visitors and parents. Sometimes the visitors are parents. I should just point out with this huge population of this first variety, north, south, east, west, and first generation and second generation, we have an even larger group of visitors and parents who come. So for sure, the kinds of issues that medical issues that they might face that might put you into contact with them is now increasing because there are more of them. So that should give you a sense of the diversity of the population of Hindus in Northeast Ohio. Add one more element of diversity, it's diversity of education. As I mentioned, in 1968, when the quota laws were changed, you had a huge number of highly educated, highly trained Hindus and Indians who entered the United States. These were largely MDs, engineers, scientists, computer scientists, not so much lawyers and not so much business people, but computer scientists, and engineers and doctors. My father was among that community. He had a PhD in biochemistry, and most of the Hindus who entered in 1968 are of that variety. And since then, we also have lots of people from India who are highly educated in this way. What you should consider when you come across one of these highly educated Hindus is that they may not be as Hindu as their parents were, and so on. That's to say that their medical training or their scientific training might have removed them from Hinduism in a way. So one should consider that too, which is that how much is education going to affect the kinds of work that you can do for them and the kinds of work they're seeking you to help, seeking your help. The next group are store or restaurant owners, blue-collar workers, and the service industry. And they also will have a different approach to Hinduism. For sure, a different approach to Hinduism. It might be because of their education, and it could be because of their background. And the last group is uneducated Hindus, who might be wives of the first group. And I say that broadly is that you have scores of 1968 Hindus who have come to America, who married their wife when she was 16, 17, largely, who married their wife when they were 16, 17, and these women never made it out, never got a high school education, which means that their English might be tremendously reduced. And consequently, their exposure to medical issues and you name it might be also reduced. It also might mean that their religiosity is enhanced. So you have an interesting situation when you have uneducated Hindus, that you have somebody who's tremendously religious but can't communicate some of these things to you because as they learn, they won't know English. Right? So consider these populations, the diversity of population in terms of geography, in terms of generation, in terms of whether or not they are from America or they've just come as relatives, what kind of education they have, and, as I've mentioned, languages. You'll be surprised to learn that India has 16 languages, official languages, and of that, there are hundreds of dialects. So subdivisions of those languages. The language that I speak with my parents is a language called Tulu, which is not one of those 16 languages. And the number of Tulu people in the United States, there might be maybe a few thousand in all the United States. Ohio, maybe about 20 families. So it's a very small group. So diversity of languages, there are so many languages in India, such that the people you come across may not be able to speak either one of those 16, and certainly not English. The national language of India is Hindi. Your average immigrant from India will know Hindi, at least a little bit. So if you ever need an interpreter, you're going to be pretty, with a first-generation immigrant or a visitor, Hindi will likely work, more than likely work Hindi. Other languages that are important in the United States, and as the Indian language is important in the United States and in Northeast Ohio, is Gujarati. 1 out of 5 Indians in the United States speak Gujarati. So, and there's a huge Gujarati population here in Ohio, Northeast Ohio, huge. So there's a pretty good chance that you run across a Hindu that's probably going to be a Gujarati. Punjabi is another language that you might come across. These are, incidentally, North Indian languages. Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi are North Indian languages. Then we have South Indian languages such as Tamil, Telugu, Kannada. You don't see Tulu there. I didn't mention Tulu, right? You don't see that there. But this is a variant of the kinds, or these are some of the languages you will come across that Hindus speak in Northeast Ohio. And as I mentioned, there are some languages that a very, very small group of people will speak here in Northeast Ohio at all, and won't be one of these. My mother-in-law speaks a language called Marwari, and Marwari is kind of vaguely a subdivision of Hindi. Could she get away with Hindi? I don't think so. She is among the uneducated, first-generation Marwari speakers. She always needs an interpreter, always will need a translator. So this is something that you should consider about diversity and about the sort of patient you might come across. You won't be surprised then that with this diversity of population, education, and languages, there's going to be a diversity of belief, or beliefs. There are, as I like to joke, there are as many types of Hinduisms as there are Hindus. And the current number is about 850 million. Right? So if I was to teach you or tell you this is what all Hindus believe, then I will be misleading you. So I'm going to confuse you and then teach you sort of what all Hindus believe, but you will know that this is only sort of, and that the average Hindu you come across might share some of those, but will more than likely have his or her own individual kind of Hindu belief that you might need to figure out. So Hinduism might be better understood as Hinduisms. There are scores of sects of Hinduism, one could say. Though this is sometimes confused with sects, we think of sects as sects in Christianity, which suggests an umbrella Christianity of which there are sects. Though there is no umbrella Hinduism in which there are sects. So someone still might identify themselves as being part of a sect of Hinduism, but don't be misled by that. There aren't really too many good English words to describe this diversity, so I'm doing my best to tell you that. One of the sects, so to speak, of Hinduism that is dominant here in Northeast Ohio that you ought to know about is the Baptist tradition, which you will not be surprised to hear is a Gujarati tradition. I'll say more about the Baptist towards the end of this discussion. But there are two major temples in Northeast Ohio. One is a Hindu temple, and the other one is the Baptist temple. So there are two dominant kind of groups of Hindus. And the Baptist is all Gujarati. All Gujarati. I've given you their telephone numbers, but I'll get to that. So there's a tremendous diversity of beliefs. Why is this, you're wondering? Isn't there a founder of Hinduism? Just like there's a founder of, say, Christianity, one could sort of say, or there's a founder of Buddhism, one could sort of say, and certainly a founder of Islam, one could certainly say. Who is the founder of Hinduism? You'd like me to say that Hindu is a guy named Hindu, these sorts of things. So Hinduism. What is Hinduism? You will be most surprised to learn that the term Hindu has its origins as a geographic term, just like the term American. If I asked you, what is an American, or what do all Americans believe, what would you say? If I asked you, what do all Americans share, what could you say other than they all tie themselves towards the continental United States? I mean, we couldn't say they're all in the United States because not all Americans are. We couldn't say that all Americans eat hot dogs because that certainly isn't the case. There are vegetarian Americans. We can't say that all Americans like baseball, could we? Or eat apple pie, could we? We'd like to, but we can't say these things. What we can say is that they all locate themselves somehow towards the United States. They're somehow oriented towards this geographic space. So the term American really is a geographic term, isn't it? I mean, it's a geographic term, no more, no less. Similarly, the term Hindu has its origins in the word Indus, in terms of the Indus River. You will be most surprised to learn that the first time the term was used was the term Sindhu. Persians used it in the 7th century to describe all of those people east of the Indus River. Those people, they're all Sindhu Hindus. Those people over there, they're Sindhus. Just like we say the Midwest. You're all from the Midwest now, right? What does that mean? It just means we're bracketed between the East Coast and the West Coast, or something like that. Similarly, the Persians in the 7th century said everybody, all those are Sindhus. By around the 11th century, it was appropriated by Muslims, you will be very surprised to learn. And they took it as a geographic term, twisted it slightly, and said all those people east of the Indus who are not Muslim. Everyone who is not us is a Hindu east of the Indus. That included, you will be very surprised to learn, not only Buddhists and Jains, and now what we call Hindus, but probably Christians. After all, Christians were east of the Indus and not Muslim. So Christians are Hindus. Anyway, so it has geographic origins. The term Hindu slowly evolves out of this, and only in the 19th century, when the Brits, who of course were commanding this kind of worldview of India, were looking for ways to describe those people who were not Christians, Muslims, or Jews. There are a small number of Jews in India. They said, let's call those people, well, what's other people? Hindus. So the term is an outside term. It's made by outsiders, used to describe those people who are not us, and who are not Christians and not Muslims, and who are not us, and are east of that river. And by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, you have census sort of taking in India, British, and the end result of the census taking are, the effect is a political organization based on the dominant religion. And suddenly you have people who now want to call themselves Hindus, so they have a vote that will match the Muslims. So my great-great-grandfather, I doubt he even knew what a Hindu was. And certainly didn't identify himself as a Hindu. Only after the British enter the picture and appropriate this term does the term become one that Hindus use. So I'm using Hindus like this. I'll stop it because my arms are hurt. But consider this now, when you think about the diversity of Hindus. Now you get it. So I said there are so many languages and the geography, and you said, yeah, this is why. It's because the term is an invented one. Now, if you run into a Hindu now and say, hey, the term is an invented one, you know, they say, like, what the hell are you talking about, and so on. So this is an academic understanding, but it explains the tremendous diversity. Tremendous diversity. Why? It's because there's nothing that really links it the way that Christianity is linked, Islam is linked. What links it? Well, American, Hindu, geographic. And then it evolved, or as I like to suggest, devolves in this way. So what do all Hindus believe? It's hard to say. They all believe that they're Hindus. But what do all Hindus believe? That you can't easily put forth what all Hindus believe because you got north, south, east, west, so many different variants, languages, practices, and 850 million. Go ahead.
So when you refer to your great-great-grandpa, what faith would he have considered himself?
Well, first he would say that he is from a sampradaya, which means something like tradition. And he would say he was a madhva, so somebody who followed the commentaries on a certain body of texts named Madhvacharya. So Madhvacharya was a great commentator, and he's a follower of that commentator, Madhvacharya. So he's from the Madhva Sampradaya. So that's what I did my PhD work, is all on the Madhva Sampradaya. Sampradaya is a pretty good translation of sect. But, does that answer your question? Okay, so that having been said, that Hinduism is this peculiar term that we want to dance around, but we want to talk about at the same time. What draws Hindus together? Coming from the Madhva Sampradaya, I can tell you these sorts of things. The text that draws some Hindus together are the Vedas, composed possibly about 14th century BCE, or 1400 BCE. These were texts that were memorized and were in Sanskrit, the language Sanskrit, S-A-N-S-K-R-I-T. And I could say for sure all Hindus orient themselves around the Vedas. That doesn't mean they all think it's true. I said orient themselves, did I not? Some Hindus think the Vedas are bunk. But they think the Vedas are bunk. They don't think the Bible is bunk. When they want to worry about a text that they're against, it'll be the Vedas. Right? So they all orient themselves around the Vedas. That doesn't mean they believe it, but if they're going to reject it or modify it or say we're not doing that, what they're going to say that we're not doing that to is the Vedas. Vedas were largely a text about sacrifice, incidentally. Very few contemporary Hindus know anything about the Vedas. They're all in Sanskrit, they're all esoteric texts, very few know about them. Though they all claim that Hinduism has its origin in the Vedas. They don't know much about it because it's in Sanskrit, but it's largely about sacrifice. The next body of text is the Upanishads. Most contemporary Hindus have heard about the Upanishads and have had some familiarity with the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the first body composed really between about 800 BCE and about 300 BCE, 400 BCE. And these texts are more theologically driven and eventually resulted in the Hinduism that I'm going to present to you in a few minutes. So if your patients ask for texts or are thinking about texts, they might be thinking about the Upanishads. Doubtful that they'll be thinking about the Vedas, but they'll think about the Upanishads. The next body of texts are epic texts, stories, not unlike the Odyssey, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata. And these are tremendously long texts about particular gods and experiences that those gods have had. As I'll say more about this in a minute, that for sure contemporary Hindus will be aware of these two texts and might look towards these texts during times of spiritual demanding times. And during some sort of medical crisis, they might look towards these texts. The last text, which I'm sure you've heard of, is the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is often described as being the Bible of Hindus. It's not the Bible of Hindus. It is a text that some Hindus find to be useful in their spiritual reflection. It's actually found within the Mahabharata. So it's actually a subdivision of the Mahabharata. You will be surprised to learn that actually British scholars and Gandhi, who read a British translation of the Bhagavad Gita, popularized the Bhagavad Gita in India. So British scholars were looking for an equivalent to the Bible, and they said, hey, look, the Bhagavad Gita. And then suddenly they said, hey, the Hindus have the Bible as the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. And then later Hindus said, we've got a Bible to the Bhagavad Gita. So you have this effect that occurred. So it's only become very popular in the last 100 years. I'll say more about these texts in a minute. Basic beliefs. Now, having told you there are no basic beliefs in Hinduism, let me give you a few. These largely grew out of the Upanishads. And why these are not, why this definition is somewhat is problematic is that other traditions, Buddhism and Jainism, also have similar beliefs. That doesn't make them Hindu, but it means it's a shared belief system that developed after about 6th century BCE. The first one, very obvious, is that there's a belief in an Atman, also known as a Jiva. Atman is more popular than Jiva. Atman means something like a self, or loosely a soul. So if somebody's going to be worrying about their soul, they'll be worrying about their Atman, or their Jiva. Or if somebody's life leaves them, somebody might say that their Jiva has left, or their Atman has moved on. So there's a belief that there's an Atman and a Jiva. Second, and I'm sure you've heard this, but I'm going to give you the technical, karma. What is karma? Karma is the mechanism of cause and effect in the universe. That's what it is. It's a mechanism of cause and effect. Mechanism of cause and effect. We have punya, which is good karma. You might say good, how do you say good karma? Good karma. Good karma is acting and thinking in ways that helps one to gain moksha. I'll tell you what moksha is in a minute, bear with me. Acting and thinking in ways that helps one to gain moksha is a good karma. Papam is bad karma. Bad karma, not surprisingly, is acting and So the Atman can accumulate karma, punya or papa, punya karma or papa karma. I would say you all have punya karma because you're here today listening to me. Right? Somebody who's not here who had to visit has some papa karma. Okay? Now, this causality affects the Atma immediately and over time. As I said, there is some that you will have some good karma. That's why you're here. Now that good karma could be something that you have reaped the benefit of that occurred only a few hours ago. It could be several days ago. It could be months ago. It could be years ago. It could be, and this is a big one, several lives ago. So there's a belief in reincarnation, or rather, rebirth. Reincarnation suggests birth in a body, karna, meat, flesh, body, but you could be reborn not in a body, as a ghost or something like that. But you're an Atman that accumulates karma over time. And this karma plays out over time. So what you do and experience now, papa or punya karma, will have an effect in the next 20 minutes, in the next hour, in the next week, in the next year, in the next, and so on and so forth. So you are part of this causality. This cycle of birth and rebirth, and this experience that you have here, in this mundane reality is called samsara. Samsara is mundane reality. So you are all in the, what I call, the karma samsara cycle. Yes? You act in ways that affect your birth and rebirth in samsara, mundane reality. This is mundane reality. You can act in some ways that will result in your birth, and I'm sure you've heard vaguely about this, that Hindus believe that you can get some papa, some bad karma, and in your future life you're reborn not as a human, perhaps as a monkey, or as a cockroach, or as an ant, or as a mosquito. Or perhaps in your previous life you were a mosquito or a cockroach or an ant, and now, because of some punya, right, you are reborn as a human. And all of you, I said somewhat facetiously, have really lots of good punya, tremendous amount of punya, because there are lots, billions of people on the earth, and you are all sitting here listening to me. Right? So this is causality, karma samsara, cycle of birth and rebirth. This is the basic theological assumption. Cycle of birth and rebirth. Affected by your atman, your jiva, is affected by your karma. Now the cycle of birth and rebirth is, how to say, tired. It's not to say it's depressing or you dislike it, but rather there's got to be something outside of this. In the same way that I tell my undergraduates that in their third year of college, they can't wait to graduate. And they think to themselves, we got to do this one more year, again and again. So the goal of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism is to break out of the cycle of birth and rebirth and get moksha. Moksha is release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. That is the goal, to break out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. Moksha. The word moksha is from the Sanskrit word much, which means to release. So it's release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Now you're going to ask me, Sharma, what is it? What happens after you break out of the cycle? And I'll say, listen, there are so many traditions of Hinduism that each one has a different idea about what happens after. Some will be more monotheistic than others. That you end up in a place like Cleveland, there's God, others will say you merge with God. And so on and so forth. So what is the content of moksha? I'm not going to tell you. Right? Nirvana is the parallel in Buddhism. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm only going to tell you that's the goal. So back to punya and papa. Punya is things that assist you in getting moksha. Papa are things that prevent you or hinder you. If you're born as a cockroach, it ain't going to help. Unless you're born as a cockroach, and you are so fortunate to listen to a teacher, perhaps maybe not me, but somebody greater than let's say Madhvacharya that I was saying, if you are born as a cockroach and you get to wander into the room where Madhvacharya is teaching and you hear that, right? So you can see how this could work. So being a human isn't always a punya thing, right? Yes? Right, so karma, samsara, moksha. Goal is moksha. Questions? This is in the back of the mind of all Hindus. This is the subtext of all Hindu practice. Is how do I get moksha? They don't wake up in the morning and say, how am I going to get moksha? But it's somewhere back there. I think about it because I'm a professor of this stuff. Okay. So a couple other concepts that are relevant to learn about basic Hinduism. Okay. Shuddha. This is key. Shuddha means purity. Hindus are worried about maintaining their shuddha, purity. Maintaining their shuddha will help them with punya or not help them with papa. So maintaining purity is on the punya side of things. You'll see in a minute how this is going to tie in with caste and class, right? You've heard about untouchables and so on. So purity is a big one. Purity largely refers to proper and improper transactions and contact. That's the broad sense of purity. Proper and improper transactions and contact. It could be transactions like conveying food, liquids. It could be human liquids. Contact could even be a shadow. So the shadow of somebody who's less pure than you, if it lays upon you, might make you impure too. And if you're impure, then it's like having a papa, which will somehow restrict your attempt to get, anybody? Moksha. Okay, you see how this is going to work. Right. It becomes especially complicated in the medical world because ashuddha is the privative prefix for not. So impurity is a great part of the whole system, right? I mean, there's lots of impurities in the medical world because bleeding and so on and so forth. Like human fluids are complicated things. So in that connection, food, body fluids, and touch are ways that shuddha gets threatened. So for sure, if you see a Hindu patient, depending on how orthodox they are, what context they're from, their education, blah, 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 etc., they might have very severe rules about shuddha. They are going to be wondering whether or not you're shuddha or ashuddha, impure or pure. In other words, does the shuddha world only revolve around other Hindus? And unless anybody here is a Hindu, it's not clear how they're going to ascertain the impurity of somebody who's outside of the Hindu context. Follow? So shuddha. The next concept is dharma, which I think there was a TV show on. Dharma and Greg. You hear about a lot about dharma. But dharma in this context means something like duty. And if you follow your dharma, then anybody, can you guess? What will you get? Punya. So dharma, punya, karma are all connected very nicely here. So depending on what kind of, now remember here, not all Hindus are thinking about all these things, right? Depends on how immersed they are in these kind of concepts. So duty. The broadest sense of duty is varna, class, which you often hear translated as caste. There are 4 varnas in Hinduism. Brahmin, which is the priestly class. Kshatriya, which is the warrior or royalty class. I think of it as administrative class. So Mayor Jackson is a Kshatriya. I don't know what you'd say if I Vaishya is a merchant class. So Steve Jobs is a Vaishya, so to speak. And Shudra is the serf class, so laborers. Now, not surprisingly, each one of these traditions, or each one of these classes has its own specific dharma, duty. Not surprisingly, each one of these classes has also shuddha attached to it. It shouldn't be surprising to you, but Brahmins are regarded as the most shuddha, pure. Shudras are the least shuddha. So the shuddha issue, I said that if you're outside of the Hindu fold, will it affect you? It's not entirely clear. It depends on who you ask. But certainly in the Hindu fold, it does affect who you touch, who you get coffee from, and so on. Yes? Okay. So, dharma, varna. Another subclass of dharma is ashrama. Ashrama is stage of life. And the stages of life are 4. And each stage of life has a different dharma. Dharma means what? Duty. So each varna has a duty, and each ashrama has a duty. First ashrama is a student ashrama. Students are supposed to study and be celibate and all these sorts of things that we imagine our children hopefully are doing. After student life, we have householder life, where your goal is to reproduce, have children, and get a job. This should be no surprise. Get a job, make some money, support the family, 2 cars, garage, this sort of thing. And after you finish your householder phase, you all look forward to retirement. So this is the retirement phase where you give up some of your householder possessions. You don't need so many. Your dharma is different. Yes? It would be different. And the last phase is the renunciant phase, where you give up all things. And it's this phase that that people who are in palliative care, I imagine, will identify with this the most. That doesn't mean that they're going to actually enter that phase. There might be some monastic tradition that exists, but they are not going to go through the initiation rites, but they will identify with that phase as a model. So that having been said, duty is indexed to varna and ashrama. So what should a Hindu do? Act according to varnashrama dharma. Okay, do you hear that? Varna ashrama dharma. Duty according to the stage of life and the class. So dharma, and here's really the key what I want you to learn. There'll be a quiz. Is that dharma is context dependent. Context dependent. What class are you? What stage of life are you? And you might ask or wonder, in the context of a premenopausal woman, what time of the month? Because your dharma, your duty, and your shuddha, shuddha means what? Purity is going to be indexed to whether or not you are menstruating. Your shuddha is also indexed, and your dharma indexed to if somebody passes away in your family. You have particular duties, and you are impure in certain sorts of ways. You will not be surprised to learn that liminal spaces, that's to say time periods that are neither here nor there, that are in between phases, right? Or in between phases are ones that are the most worrisome because the purity is to be determined. So you will be surprised, and I'll qualify it, is that when a baby is born in the family, it's actually a moment of great impurity. And you say, why is it? It's a great, glorious thing. Well, if you consider infant mortality, it's actually quite dangerous. So a family has a child for about 13, 14 days until the child is named. They wait this long. People will visit, but the family is a little bit impure in a peculiar sort of way. Why? Because their shuddha is to be determined. Similarly, when somebody passes away, that family becomes impure in a peculiar sort of way. And they have certain dharma that they need to follow. So dharma is context dependent. So when you have a patient, what they see themselves doing or the things that they ought to do to be a proper Hindu is determined by varnashrama dharma, time of the month, context dependency. Yes? Okay. So how do you get moksha? You're wondering, right? How do you get moksha? Besides punya. So there are 3 ways to get moksha in the history of Hinduism. One is karma yoga, which means the discipline of action, doing things. This was largely a Vedic phenomena and was somewhat overcome by another way to get moksha, which is jnana yoga, the discipline of knowledge, esoteric knowledge leading to moksha. This was largely an Upanishadic sort of phenomenon. So in the Upanishads we have ways to get moksha that's all highly theoretical and philosophical. Jnana, by the way, is cognate with the English word gnosis. So GNO, JNA, cognate. Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. The kind of chief way to get moksha these days, that you find most Hindus buying into is bhakti yoga, and this is what I'm going to spend the most time on. Bhakti yoga is path to moksha by devotion. Bhakti means devotion. Your average Hindu looks at him or herself in these terms. As a bhakti yogin, one whose discipline is devotion. Bhakti requires devas. Devas are gods, cognate with the English word divine. Devas are gods. Hindus have lots of them. As Hindus like to joke, there's at least one for every day of the year, but 365 million gods. There are gods where you look. Gods and goddesses. So people offer devotion to these gods and goddesses, and offering such devotion assists them in developing punya and ultimately moksha. Okay? They go to the temple, they worship these gods, they say praise of these gods, something that you should, if I said God, you would be familiar with it. Now add gods, then it slightly changes things, but the behavior is not so different. You have bhajans. Bhajans means devotional songs. This will play a significant role, as you can well imagine, in palliative care. So people sing bhajans in praise of particular devas and devis gods. They also say mantras, or as you like to say, mantra. Right? Mantra is actually man, mantra. Mantra is, think of mantra as not quite a prayer, but a sacred utterance. So there are mantras affiliated with particular gods that one might chant in particular times. For sure, in palliative care practices, bhajans and mantras are a key component. For sure. That someone will have either mantras chanted for them on their behalf, priests will chant them, or they will chant them themselves. So mantras, bhajans help with bhakti that helps towards moksha. Darshan. Darshan is a very interesting word, and it means seeing and being seen by the divine. And it is this sense that images of devas means gods, are in the images, there's a dynamic relationship with the images. So having a glimpse of an image is obtaining darshan. I follow my language. Having a glimpse of an image is obtaining darshan, will inspire bhakti, and is for sure going to give you punya. So in palliative care, a Hindu who is in palliative care will seek darshan of whatever image of a deva is in that location. So the imagery is tremendously important for inspiring bhakti. Yes? Basic Hinduism. That was basic Hinduism. Now, I'm having a lot of fun here. So let me give you some general clinical issues, okay? Which will now, I want you to think about this through the lens that I've just given you, okay? So general clinical issues that I think you will come across. Family responsibility. The dharma of the children. It's the duty of the children that when a Hindu becomes sick or ill, the children have especially dharmic duties. Right? They are dharmically supposed to take care of the parents in certain ways. So there's a sense of innate obligation, one could say, that will drive people. So what drives a child to, or a child of somebody who's not well, to do something or to worry about that parent is this dharmic obligation. And that's, I guess, how it would be framed. Other these are general clinical issues that you're going to come across, is that they are dietary restrictions. After all, you want to maintain your shuddha as per your dharma. Right. Not surprisingly, many Hindus are vegetarian. So dietary restrictions are very important to consider for Hindus in palliative care. This should be no surprise. Consequently, it's important to know, it might be important to know, depending on how orthodox that Hindu is, who cooked the meal. Hence, you should consider the importance of home-cooked meals for somebody who's in a hospice such as this one. And Hindus will want to bring in food, not because, well, home-cooked meal is tastier, but because they want to make sure that shuddha is maintained. Right? So my mother-in-law, for example, is tremendously orthodox. She will not eat at a restaurant. Her level of dietary restriction should remind you of a Hasidic Jew who's trying to keep kosher, right? Certain utensils can't be used, and so on and so forth, right? So my mother-in-law will not go to a restaurant because the utensil might at one time have contact with meat. End of story. So you might have a Hindu in palliative care who has extreme dietary restrictions in this way, and then the best way for them to deal with these dietary restrictions is home-cooked meals, without a doubt. Similarly, a broad kind of general clinical issues is that, as I said, renunciation was the fourth ashrama, right? We have a minimalist diet that might be taken on by somebody who's in palliative care, where they begin restricting the foods they eat, such that they eat the absolute minimum. There are traditions in Hinduism and in the broad South Asian context where, in fact, the palliative care is combined with a kind of self-euthanasia where patients will starve themselves ultimately to death. You don't see this as frequently, but you have a restriction then. Perhaps you are, it's likely to have a reduction in the sorts of things that people eat. They'll eat just one piece of bread and some fruit, maybe, something like that. They'll reduce things. And this, you can see how it will tie in with renunciation and a kind of sense of self-purification. Another broad, general clinical issue is pain thresholds. Is that you'll find that Hindus have a very high pain threshold. Why is this? You might now recall that we spoke about karma. So why am I in such a situation to have this pain? Some karma I did in the past. So there's some sense of self-responsibility that will restrict you from taking any palliative care. After all, I must have done something in the past. Some papam is there. Why I'm in this situation now. So no, don't give me any pain medications. I want to experience this. In some sense, it might also be to manifest that papam karma. Right? After all, karma develops over time. You have its cause and effect. So you wouldn't want to restrict the effect of the karma you created in the past. So Hindus are reluctant to take pain meds because they hold themselves responsible. Not quite in a punishment sense. It's not a punishment, but it's my karma, so then let me experience this pain. Like that. It's a broad, general clinical issue. Another broad clinical issue is bathing. Bathing and shuddha. Shuddha means what? Right. So you can see how that's going to tie together. Something that you should consider is that when Hindus bathe, it has to be free-flowing water rather than taking a bath in a bathtub. A bath in a bathtub is a tremendously dirty thing, is what it's imagined. This should be free-flowing water. That's to say, a shower, water in that way. If you say to a Hindu, I'll give you a bath and put you in a tub, they'll think this is the dirtiest thing possible. Whereas a free-flowing shower is the way to continuously have shuddha water. Along those lines, bathing should occur daily, for sure, daily. And if it doesn't occur daily, then the patient will think that there's some ashuddha, for sure. that might become very difficult in some scenarios. But for sure, that difficulty is because of this idea of shuddha, purity. In fact, the morning time is the best time to have this kind of bathing. I'll give you an example. In my particular sampradaya, I am not permitted to eat until I bathe and say some mantras and show my bhakti towards a particular deva. Right? You want to put that in English? Right. I'm not allowed to eat until I bathe and chant some sacred utterances that show my devotion towards a particular god. So some Hindus might think in those terms. Then feeding them will become somewhat complicated. There are exceptions. In particular times of crises, some of these shuddha rules can be broken. Just a quick aside, it drove my wife insane. A few years ago, when we had our first daughter. She went into labor and she was contracting. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning. We called up. They said, "You better come in." And I was really hungry. And I made some breakfast to take with me en route. And I said to my wife out loud, and she holds this against me still. She said, "Should I take a bath or not?" Because I can't eat this unless I take a bath. And she said, "No. Heck with all of your rules, This is a time of crisis." So I reasoned myself, okay, the time of crisis, I'll resolve these things. And then I went back, right? And that's because I'm more orthodox than she is. But you can see what kind of trouble I got myself into and how I had to reason about the dharma of a crisis time and the shuddha for somebody who's varna and ashrama in a crisis time. Palliative care medicine contexts are typically crisis times, but you might have to convince somebody that. They may not want to be convinced of that. If so, then there's some things that you're going to have to do to make sure that they can even eat. But if they choose to eat very little, it might be because they're being minimalist and thinking about renunciation. You follow? Is that helpful? All right, cool. Modesty, no surprise, is a broad clinical issue. Shuddha, modesty. Not surprisingly, this largely is something that women experience. And oftentimes, you might need an interpreter rather than relying on the husband. As my wife points out to me, when she sees women, South Asian women in the clinic, if they come with their husband, they will not be willing to talk about menstrual cycles and so on if that man is there. So you will not get, as she tells me, you will not get the information you want. Get an interpreter. Don't rely on the husband. Is it funny say that on the husband? But at any rate, get an interpreter, which is why the languages is so important. Hindi is a good bet. Not surprising, issues of clothing and nudity are also a broad clinical issue that you should consider. Not surprisingly, the gender of the healthcare practitioner is relevant. Same sex is preferable. You can see how this is all going to work. And as my wife reminded me to remind you that the students and residents' gender is relevant. They will ask her, what is the gender of your resident who's going to come? And if it's not the same sex, my wife tells me, you will not get the same information. You will not get the information you need. They will withhold information because this student who is, we all want students and interns to be doing a great thing, but if you got the wrong gender, you may not get the information you need. So these are all things that you can remind yourselves and remind medical practitioners that you might be assisting or observing. Palliative care issues. Disclosure. Hindus don't like to tell their parents or other Hindus that they're dying. So there's a protection of the dying from this knowledge. A paternalistic approach is largely preferred. Let the doctor dictate everything, and we don't question it, and so on. This is largely the drive. Though for sure, in Northeast Ohio, come to think of it, such a huge percentage of the Indians in Northeast Ohio actually are doctors at the clinic or UH that you won't see this. But for non-medical I mean, consider what I said about education, right? So people who are not educated, perhaps in the medical world, might first not want to tell their parents, and second, will be so paternalistic, will want a paternalistic experience with their medical care. This is classically Hindu. There is a preference to die at home, for sure. Which I guess that now I understand that this institution actually does great work for people who are more people at home, I suppose, is what he said. So the preference to die at home with family. As I mentioned, karma is not to be underestimated. Suffering and pain because of your karma is very important to consider when you're dealing with palliative care. Faith, it goes along with karma. It is my karma to be experiencing this. And consequently, acceptance of the particular situation that they're in might be there simply because of this reasoning via karma. I'm here because of my karma. I'm not going to take the medicine because of that. So it is simply my karma that I'm to pass away at this time in this place for these reasons. So don't forget the importance of this causal mechanism. In terms of withdrawal of treatment in DNR, you are bound to run into questions of understanding. People won't understand what it is that you're asking them about. Why? Because of language problems. Uneducated, I mentioned, language problems. Right? The uneducated Hindus here will have language problems. It is essential for you to really explain this to them. And if you can't explain it, you get an interpreter. A tremendous suspicion of things that they have to sign. Why? Because people don't understand. So it's essential that you make sure they understand. I mean, I think that you have a lot of Hindus who would be in support of the do not resuscitate. They won't understand it. And if they don't understand it, then when the time is critical, then they will have lost a great opportunity. That's what language is. Caring for a dying Hindu. A few points to mention. Icons are very important. I mentioned the importance of darshan. So it's very important to have imagery. You should ask what sort of images are important to the patient. Different patients and different Hindus have different gods they want to see. You can't just put one up. You can't assume that it's going to be the god that you're familiar with because of watching Dharma and Greg, things like that. You should ask, do you want an icon or image up of your deity? Which one would that be? These ought not to be placed at the foot of the bed. Feet are ashuddha. Walls are good places to put things. Tables are a great place to put things. But putting it actually on the feet or anywhere near the feet may not be a good thing. Christian imagery may not be a good thing to have in the room either. So you might have to take it down. So if you have a Hindu patient, you could ask them, but they are unlikely to say that they don't want to see it. But it would probably be a good idea just to take it down and assume that they don't. Some rituals that ensure a good death. As I mentioned, and as you can probably guess, these rituals are context and regionally dependent. You should ask the family or the patient, if possible, what sorts of things he or she want to do. I can't give you a list of all Hindus want such and such a thing. I can't quite do that. But you can be sure that maintaining shuddha and avoiding ashuddha is important. Holy water from the Ganga, the Ganges River, is also important and can somehow be involved in rituals that this patient pursues. So you might, if you come into a situation, you might ask the family of the patient if they can obtain some holy water for this patient, that this patient can use during these rituals. Hindus like oil lamps and incense. And you're going to say, well, wait, in most hospital settings, you really can't burn these sorts of things. Well, there are electric candles that you can use. Of course, in a home setting, you could burn all the oil and incense. But oil, incense, candles, somehow oriented or near the icon or the image of the deity is a way to get punya and is a way to get show bhakti for the deva, devotion to the god. There are no doubt prayers, mantras, and meditation that the patient might want to engage in. Consequently, quiet meditation spaces are a great idea. Places where they can go and meditate. It could be in the same room, and if it's in the same room, setting up some sort of altar space where you have these icons set up, and incense and so on, would go a long way. Prayer books, there aren't any standard ones, but there are books that they might have on their own, their children can obtain, that you can find at the Hindu temple, that have mantras and bhajans, songs, that will allow them to express their bhakti. You can ask, are there any prayer books that you need or that your relative needs? Devotional music is a great thing to play. When I first moved here 6 years ago, my father's oldest sister passed away here in Cleveland. She underwent some surgery and so on, and we went and visited her, and she was unconscious and was not able to respond to us. And we lit an electric candle. This was in an ICU. We lit an electric candle, turned on an electric candle, and we played bhajans from a little cassette player to the deva, the god that we knew would be, or we believed to be efficacious in her situation, and one that she would like. And we consequently created a space for her and for us, for her to have this kind of, as I said, with diet for the palliative, in palliative care, you can have restrictions, home-cooked meals, and fasting. Visitors. The Hindu community here is a big one, though in some sense it's also a small one. We don't all have lots of relatives here. Our relatives are often, we often extend our idea of who a relative is to the larger community. As I said, there are only 20 Hindu-speaking families in Ohio. I am sure I can call any of them up and tell them who I am, and they will come out and help me at any moment today. They see themselves as part of my family and community. So you will have lots of non-family members as family members in the Hindu context. Post-mortem practices. Place body on the floor with the head facing north is one general practice. Water and the tulsi, which is a plant, which is regarded as the holy basil plant, or the Latin name is the Osmum teniflorum, is placed in the mouth. Not surprisingly, there are regional practices which you can ask the family about. You should notify relatives immediately if they are not present, because it is essential that the cremation occurs very quickly. So you will definitely want to expedite death certificates to ensure speedy cremation. It really ought to happen within 4, 5, 6 hours. These days, it takes a couple of days.
Why is that? What's the worry?
The worry, well, historically, we will say that the worry has been decomposition of the body. India, 115 degrees, get rid of the body. You cremate the body. So not get rid of it, cremate the body. But overall, there's a sense that the Atman is going to leave, and you want, when you cremate, you allow this process to occur. And so you ensure a good death when the cremation is quick. And then the Atman will leave the body and will be in another world sort of for about 13 days and then re-enter another one. So you begin this 13-day process. So the family will be in a particular kind of grieving process for 13 days after the cremation, Jeff. So if you wait, and delays everything. Autopsy, you have to ask the family. I cannot tell you all Hindus are for or against and so on. I couldn't say. But if there must be an autopsy, it surely will delay the cremation, and you need to consider that there's a standard bereavement period of 13 days where the family is ashuddha, impure, for 13 days, and that will be prolonged. A Brahmin priest will more than likely be involved in Northeast Ohio, the Shiva Vishnu Temple in Parma. There's the telephone number. They perform funerals. The suggested donation is $251. So if you need to put somebody in contact with somebody to help them with this, that's the number to call. And somebody will reply to you or will answer you very quickly because they know the rules about the cremation. If somebody's a member of the BAPS temple, this Gujarati group, that's the telephone number there. My guess, though, is that the BAPS community people will not be pursuing hospice, any kind of palliative care hospice. The Bush Funeral Home, and I think I said in the beginning that I don't have any disclosures, I don't own stock in Bush Funeral Home or anything like that. But the Bush Funeral Home is next door, right next door to the Hindu temple in Parma. Anybody from Parma? So down Ridgewood Road, right next to Lucida's, right? You've got the Bush Funeral Home and you've got the Hindu temple. I've been to 2 or 3 cremations in Cleveland. They're all at the Bush Funeral Home. It's right next door to the Hindu temple. They know what to do. For sure, I mean, I'm not recommending them because I own stock or something. There are lots of funeral homes in Cleveland, but I know that these people know what they're doing. And that they're right next door to the Hindu temple. So there isn't that much more time, but do you have any questions? What are your clinical experiences? Did you learn something? I sure hope so. Thanks so much for this opportunity.
I saw a question. We can do a couple questions.
Please.
Yeah, you mentioned about the bathing
Yes.
and the fact that it would be from running water,
Yes.
and yet, you know, our concept, or at least mine, is that the rivers are polluted, and you know, how do they achieve that bathing process?
So bathing simply just water from a tap. What are you driving at? Is that when I say flowing, I mean that flowing from a tap. I mean, is that what you mean?
Well,
Try me again. I don't follow.
I guess, you know, that the numbers of people that don't even have running water.
Oh,
In
well,
India.
Oh, in India.
Yeah.
Oh, well, in India, people may not have immediately running water, but they will certainly be able to get it and then store it. So everybody's got some water in India. So you'll have people who store water in tanks. So for example, when I was living in Bangalore back in 1995, the water was turned on once a day at it's like at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's always some insane time. And there was you had 2 ways to get it. One is it actually went into your house and everybody had a giant tank where they stored all this water. And so everybody turned the water on at 6 a.m. and filled up the tank, and then constantly all activities using water relied on that tank. Cooking, bathing, and people are very careful. It's a bit like camping. You've been camping before? Right? Well, you know, when you go camping, if you're in a certain sort of area, you might have to carry in water with you. So that sort of sense. The other option was to go down to the first floor, and there was a tap that was a shared tap, and you had people lined up with big buckets, and we all had to haul the water back. Now, so there are ways to store water that people use for these purposes. Does it answer your question?
How are the Hindus in this country receptive to hospice?
Well, I would say that it's only very recently that Hindus now are aging because of the 1968, right? And it's only in the last 5-10 years that Hindus are dying in the United States. There were Hindus who died before, but now they're dying in a larger, because of this age. And I think that your average Hindu would be reluctant to seek hospice because, as I mentioned, the dharma of the children. They'd say, what kind of children do these people have if they sent their relative off into hospice? So they would be really reluctant to have hospice care where the patient is kept in a hospice center like this. Hospice care where the patient is at home, they might be more open to it for sure, because not everyone can take care of the patient in the ways that it needs to be taken care of. This is a new phenomenon. So along those lines, and you can see where I'm driving, where I'm going with this. So along those lines, you have huge numbers of retired Hindus in Florida. You have lots of retired people in Florida, but huge numbers in Florida. And very recently, I learned that some Hindu physicians in Florida put together, or are putting together, a hospice nursing home sort of a institution for Hindus to address these issues. And so this is slowly becoming something that we see. So I think it's going to develop even more so in the next 15 years, when the 1968 population, my father is 70, 75 or so, when this population becomes 85, you will see more of these things, for sure, and people will be more open to it. Whether the Hindu community responds as they did in Florida and create their own, or there's more education, as hopefully what I'm doing, and there becomes a greater availability, one could say. I'm sure we'll see some.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Patrick. You're
I've only worked with one Hindu patient. She was, I think, in her 90s.
Wow.
And she had to go to a nursing facility for safety reasons. And our team had her for quite a while. And everything that you described about what she did, I mean, the images, the prayers, the recitations. But one thing that her daughter brought in like a small television set where you could put a video in it.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And it showed ritual dancing near the Ganges River, I think.
Oh, is that?
And it had her language as stuff, so it could be a visual thing
Absolutely.
with the music too.
Absolutely. Along those lines, there were serials that were created, that episodes of the Ramayana. I mentioned the Ramayana, and for sure, I'm quite confident that showing somebody in palliative care episodes in the Ramayana will be getting that kind of darshan and bhakti. So there are also visual ways. I did not consider that, but for sure, there are visual ways and media that people will see, for sure. That's a good point. I'll add that next time. Any other questions? Have you all understood basic Hinduism? That really was my key here. My question for you is this: is I gave you like basic Hinduism and the basic kind of theological components. Is this something that you were familiar with already, and you went, "Oh yeah, right," or you're like, "No way, this is what they really think"? So how many people know way this is what they really think? Just a couple. How many people are like, "Oh yeah, I've heard something like this before"? Okay, a few of you. So somewhere, hopefully I clarified it for those of you who've been exposed to it, and those of you who've never been exposed to it. I hope you learned something about these theological structures. So.
I'm just wondering, for a Hindu person receiving hospice, with so many of us having different backgrounds as spiritual care coordinators, you did mention like how Hindus relate to other faiths. Are they accepting of Catholicism? Are they accepting of Jews? How are they with other faiths?
Well, I think that Hindus largely are accepting. And it's partly, I mean, this is half said facetiously, but it's partly true, is that ultimately all of you are Hindus. Right? Because you ultimately, if birth and rebirth, right, it's just that you've been born in the wrong time and the wrong place. So you're all varieties of Hindu. So in fact, there's historically, Jesus was regarded as an avatar, an incarnation of the god Vishnu. So you have what's called inclusion, right? So inclusivism is an inclusivist sense. Recently in India, right-wing Hindu fundamentalists have been very anti-Muslim, goes without saying, but anti-Christian. So you have a small, vocal, anti-Christian fanatical group. You do see some right-wing Hindu fundamentalists here, but they are very unlikely to see classical care. So you will very unlikely come in contact with them. There is a degree of racism in the Hindu community. If I might add that there's a suspicion of African Americans for sure. And I don't know how that would play out. other than the negative. I don't want you also to consider that every Hindu you meet is going to be racist, but I don't know how, that it doesn't usually play out as well as it would. Other question?
Is there a resource for mantra, for song?
Hindu temple. I would call it the Hindu temple and ask them for sure. I'm reluctant to say go on the web, right? Because there are scores, 850 million sites where you can find these sorts of things. Some of them are more accurate than others, and so on. You could successfully find something. I mean, look at it this way: is that if the patient is okay with web generated mantras, then go for it. If it was me, I'm so skeptical of anything I see on the web because it makes kind of great assumptions about what all Hindus believe, that I'd say go to the temple and ask an expert at the temple. But you could have some success using the web. You could have some successes. Go ahead.
How receptive are Hindu people in regards to people outside of Hinduism being inquiring of Hindu practice? Because even in the Orthodox Jew is not interested.
I think Hindus are largely okay with it and don't have any worry. What they would worry about is inquiry that is, it's very easy for a Hindu to be defensive or insecure that your inquiry is really out to show how Hinduism is stupid, right? And so, why are you asking this? And then they might be defensive or apologetic and so on. But most Hindus will tell you, oh, we're doing this and this and this, for the most part. But they might be just a little reluctant, worrying what you're going to do with that information. But given the context, I don't think they'd be as reluctant as they would be if they just read us and they were wrong. Other questions? Basic Hinduism? Is there time for a quiz?
No time for a question.